Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kelly Simonton, and I'm presenting today on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Victoria Shiver. The title of our presentation is Phases of Development and Learning and Applying the Spectrum of Teaching Styles, a Mixed Methods Longitudinal Study with Pre-Service Teachers. Over the last several decades, research has suggested that despite the myriad of instructional strategies that teachers can use, there still seems to be a continued use of traditional and limited approaches to teaching PE, despite the evidence that shows those strategies can limit student engagement, learning, and motivation. However, research also suggests that teachers who can gain knowledge in the concepts and strategies like the spectrum that will enhance and diversify their teaching toolbox, which allows them to better address student needs and enhance the delivery of other things like models-based practices. There's reason to believe that the earlier in a teacher's development or career, the introduction of things like the spectrum of teaching styles will increase a diverse set of strategies. However, learning about the spectrum and its value must be trained and bought in by pre-service teachers to maintain those strategies when they become in-service teachers. The spectrum and other strategies like models-based practices challenge pre-service and in-service teacher beliefs, which means that more systematic approaches are needed in order to gain that buy-in. The spectrum provides a framework in which multiple strategies are used and can be used by teachers that can support their teaching and the goals that they have for their students. Teachers can identify what goals they have and use these skills and strategies to plan, implement, and reflect on student learning. In these learning moments, often called episodes, teachers will articulate the role that they play as well as the role that the learner will play in order to complete the task correctly. In addition, knowledge of the styles and seeing them as foundational for teachers enhances their generalized pedagogical content knowledge in task delivery. It's easy to see how the spectrum and knowing about the spectrum and being able to utilize it can enhance the teacher's toolbox or set of tools they have in order to teach the strategies and meet their diverse needs. In this current study, there has been less research on pre-service teachers in general on how they use the spectrum and how they gain to understand the spectrum as compared to research showing in-service teachers. So for this study, we focus on in-service teachers. Findings suggest that learning about the spectrum moves teaching from an abstract idea of simply relaying skills and giving feedback to students to more incremental, progressive, and episodic learning that enhances student development. Pre-service teachers have responded that learning about the spectrum of teaching styles previously takes a lot of time and practice, but they tend to see the benefits and utilize those strategies in the future if they're able to overcome the challenges they perceive. In a recent study that myself and some colleagues did, we found that in one semester, students could enhance their perceived ability and usefulness of styles A, B, and F. And qualitatively, we saw that their instructional comfortability for pre-service teachers is significantly increased when they get early field experiences in real K-12 school settings. Also, by using things like foregrounding techniques, it can heighten their desire to utilize the styles because teaching with the teaching styles becomes a central foci of what it means to be a physical education teacher. However, within that one semester project, we also saw that students struggled with aligning spectrum of teaching strategies with the learning objectives they had. So, for example, why would I select a specific teaching style based on a specific goal that I had? In addition, we saw that pre-service teachers also began to show a lot of interest in how the connection of the teaching styles or utilization of the styles was really connected to models-based practices that they were learning. So in alignment with that previous study, a more longitudinal approach, we wanted to ground the study in similar concepts. So the first of those concepts being the foregrounding technique of teaching and learning, which suggests that as pre-service teachers learn how to be a teacher and what strategies to use, that they would automatically reflect on using the spectrum of teaching styles as essential to understanding how teaching and learning happens in PE. In addition, it's critical to address the mental model of pre-service teachers, which the mental model is a summary of what pre-service teachers believe what is PE, what does it mean to teach PE, and what does it mean to be a PE teacher. The discussions with students in learning about the spectrum also has to address what they believe the purpose of physical education is. If programs fail to address the mental model along with the technical aspects of teaching, it's likely that pre-service teachers will not adopt the spectrum because they don't see their mental model doesn't change to the realities of what it means to be a teacher. And so, with those concepts in mind, the purpose of the study was to take that longitudinal mixed methods approach to explore how pre-service teachers and a PEAT program uh, in a PEAT program can influence their knowledge and use of the spectrum. We had a few specific research questions we intended to address, including to what degree do pre-service teachers' perceived abilities and usefulness change over time? What training experience had the biggest influence as it relates to the spectrum? And what if factors impeded their mental model or practical applications of the spectrum. In this study, we had 10 pre-service teachers from one Western university. These students were followed in their professional program, which was the final 2 years or 4 semesters of their PEAT experience. All pre-service teachers participated in specific training in which we considered foregrounding. That included reflection on their K-12 experiences, lectures on the spectrum teaching strategies, as well as online training MOOCs, spectrum practical workshops in which students were experienced and practiced real episodic teaching in the gym with real PE lessons, and then they're planning, implementing, and reflecting on the spectrum episodes that were assigned to them in real K-12 settings with real K-12 students. These are all considered foregrounding techniques as based on the pillars provided by Pill and Rankin and Tinning, in which we encourage critical reflection of pre-service teachers from their previous K-12 experiences to what they're learning now about being a teacher and what teaching and learning is, the proper development of planning techniques using the spectrum and how it can assist in reaching instructional goals lesson by lesson or task by task, and the inclusion and implementation in real authentic K-12 settings, followed by reflection for areas of improvement and maintenance. These students completed pre-post surveys, and 6 of the 10 students completed interviews. The surveys included the PE teacher perception of teaching styles, which measured 2 variables: usefulness of the spectrum and perceived ability. Semi-structured interviews were focused on the foregrounding techniques and the mental model that pre-service teachers had following each of the 4 semesters. For data analysis, we utilized a repeated measures Mancova following Cronbach's alpha reliability of the usefulness and ability scores and composite mean scores. Given the low sample size, we really tried to evaluate mean trends over time and had to look at any significant changes with a bit of a critical lens because of that low sample size. In terms of the qualitative analysis, we used open and axial coding from verbatim transcripts following each semester, used inductive and deductive analysis, and then we maintained a coding process to develop categories and themes based on those pre-service teacher questions, which were specific to the degree that the PEAT program helped them understand the spectrum, what influenced it, and what may have impeded their potential future use. We also maintained reliability by using peer debriefing, constant comparison, and negative case analysis. For the quantitative results, we wanted to identify a few trends in the data. We saw that at time 2 and at time 4 for perceived usefulness of the styles, where we saw the highest mean scores. Primarily at time 2, we saw some slightly higher scores than we did at time 4. So if you were to read this scale, scores happened at the beginning of the first of their last 4 semesters. So pre was beginning before semester 1, S1 was at the end of semester 1, S2 at the end of semester 2, S3 at the end of semester 3, and S4 at the end of semester 4. For the PEAT program being studied, semester 4 served as the full-time student teaching experience, meaning they weren't taking classes on campus with the PEAT program. They were fully engaged as a student teacher. However, semesters 1, 2, and 3, they were both taking classes in their pre-service teacher program and engaging in practicum experience, so teaching in schools a small amount of lessons as well. We have some other rationale as to why we think we saw the heightened scores at semester 2 and semester 4, which we'll get into in some of the discussion. But we also see some positive trajectory trends from pre to semester 4, meaning that we saw a pretty steady incline in perceived usefulness across those semesters, which is positive. There were a few cases where the usefulness slightly dropped in semester 4, and again, during the student teaching experience where the faculty have less oversight and say in what students are doing as compared to like a cooperating teacher may help explain why we see some slight drops there, as the cooperating teacher may not be emphasizing some of the spectrum strategies as the faculty were when they had more oversight over the pre-service teachers. Similarly, at perceived abilities of the styles, we see that students had reported the highest mean scores of their perceived ability towards the end of their pre-service teaching training program. Again, we see this as a positive, as that students steadily progressed in their perceived ability for using the styles as they made their way through the multiple semesters in which they were asked to use them. Qualitatively, we want to point out kind of a progressive set of themes that we found going from semester 1 through semester 4 of the pre-service program. In semester 1, in the initial experiences, students were able to identify that their teaching of the use of the spectrum teaching styles was impacting student engagement and critical thinking. Specifically, it provided more variety and engagement for the students that they were teaching, and they felt that they were meeting more diverse needs. Pre-service teachers were identifying that there were more than one way to teach, and in fact, utilizing that more than one way to teach mindset was really supporting their students and their development as a teacher. In semester 2, this was really heightened in their increased awareness about how teachers can help, teaching styles can help them be more effective in actually being a teacher, which makes sense from semester 1 to semester 2, because typically in early on semesters, students may be pre-service teachers, excuse me, may really feel like I'm trying to manage my students and I really want them just to learn something. And so providing more strategies help them both manage and provide that learning goal. However, as we see them progress into semester 2, it really became more about the student they were teaching and less about them as a teacher. And so that heightened awareness that the teaching styles provided in being more effective and being a quality teacher was really critical. In addition, during this semester, which aligns with some of the quantitative data, the pre-service teachers were really starting to focus on additional models-based practices. So beyond things like the skill theme approach to teaching, students, pre-service teachers were being asked to utilize tactical games approaches and teaching games for understanding, and even some introduction into sport education model. And they were starting to connect that the teaching styles really helped them in the episodes and the in-task design when they had to meet the models-based practice, that the styles really helped with that as well. In semester 3, pre-service teachers that the report of consistency in their PEAT program classes or lack thereof was really critical into their comfortability and perceived kind of effectiveness in utilizing the styles. So for example, from semester to semester in the practicum teaching classes, if the PEAT program required them to use teaching styles and reflect as opposed to suggested using teaching styles with some of the models that the pre-service teachers were learning, it really impacted their foci on the teaching styles, which subsequently is going to impact their use and perceived value of the teaching styles. Also, the enhanced nature now, and that given that they had a better understanding of models-based practices, they were clearly identifying that some teaching styles, although all can be used, were really lending themselves to some specific strategies, which showed how that foregrounding technique, meaning if I'm a good teacher and I use teaching and learning strategies in the models, I have to know how to use the spectrum of teaching strategies. That was really enhanced in semester 3. In semester 4, where again students were out full time, being pre-service teachers were out being a full-time student teacher, they really saw that utilizing the teaching styles enhances the learning of all students, and that they really felt that the strategies or the styles that they had previously learned became quote unquote natural in their teaching. We don't have evidence that these things were naturally occurring, but through the pre-service teacher reflection, they tended to respond to say, oh, I was using those styles and I really didn't, I wasn't even aware of it. Or I really didn't want to be a boring teacher today and use the same strategies I used the day before. And so they would reflect upon the diversity of strategies that they could have used from their pre-service teacher training into their student teaching. Upon reflection and future use, the positive result of utilizing this teaching styles throughout their teacher education program prompted pre-service teachers to state that they would use them in the future as well. So for some discussion points, the first two bullets really align with some of the cross-sectional one semester data that we found previously, in that pre-service teachers must have early and frequent experiences using the teaching styles. And that goes beyond simply lecturing or having some short workshops on the spectrum, that they must be utilizing them with authentic experiences in K-12 schools. In addition to that, PEAT programs must require the planning, practice, and reflection of the spectrum in order to shift or to begin shifting pre-service teacher mental models. If pre-service teacher mental models are not addressed, meaning we have to adjust the naive perspective they have about what it means to be a teacher, or that narrow scope of teaching is going to simply continue if we don't address what teaching is in the mental model process. Some new findings that go into this longitudinal study beyond what was just pointed out is viewing the spectrum as part of a models-based practice may be a way to not only enhance the delivery of a model, things like the tactical games, teaching games for understanding, or sport education approaches, but that the spectrum then becomes a discrete set of teaching strategies that they find of most value to utilize within those models. And so, really, in the program, in under this investigation, we see that, if the model itself serves as a framework, like a house frame, then the teaching styles really serve as to how we decorate the house, what goes in the house, what color is the house, what furniture is in the house. When we use that analogy, we see that the model provides us a lot of frame and structure of the general sequence of a unit, for example, and the teaching strategies and the teaching styles really become the day-to-day in-task designs that are going to help us reach the unit goals. And so they really work in conjunction, and some of those styles students were naturally seeing as more supportive of those models-based practice compared to maybe others. We also saw that if students have negative experiences, they have reduced requirements by their PEEP faculty, or they're only limited to using the truest forms of the spectrum. This can really deter pre-service teachers from maintenance, because if they aren't able to reflect on the negative experiences and see them as learning moments and only sees them as failed, this style, quote unquote, doesn't work and I had a bad experience, I'm not using that style again. If we don't interject in those moments, it's less likely that pre-service teachers are going to use those styles in the future. Additionally, if we don't have consistency and flexibility about what it means to use the styles, meaning not watered down versions, but adapted versions for their developmental level of the pre-service teacher learning how to use the styles, if we're too rigid in the delivery and assessment of the pre-service teachers, that can really deter their future use as opposed to supporting their future use. In conclusion, the spectrum can be used to enhance pre-service teachers' instructional accountability, their knowledge, and their mental model of how they see teaching. Using the foregrounding technique seems to be a pretty positive way, but takes a significant amount of time and must be planned systematically and intentionally through multiple semesters for the students. The field experiences are the biggest impact, and teaching students how to not only plan, implement, but how to reflect and retry those styles is essential in supporting their perceived value, usefulness, and ability in the spectrum of teaching styles. There needs to be more time spent in aligning the spectrum with students' capability, the pre-service teachers' capabilities. So picking specific styles that maybe are a little bit easier for a teacher to use while they're first in their practicum experiences maybe probably needs more investigation, but seems to be a logical need as opposed to trying to cram, for example, a lot of teaching styles into a single semester and giving it more progressive over multiple semesters may enhance that learning for pre-service teachers. In addition, identifying more alignment between models-based practices and specific content for pre-service teachers with specific styles. Future research should work on each of those areas, but ultimately our takeaway is that creating a more systematic framework for teaching about the spectrum, that means both across semesters and within semesters. What is the developmental phase of a pre-service teacher in learning and finding value in the spectrum? That really needs more consideration. There likely needs to be more intentional approaches and systematic ways of doing that. Not to say that all programs are the same, but the lack of systematic approaches likely means that a surface level understanding is going to be developed by a pre-service teacher, and certainly without addressing the mental model of what the spectrum is and the framework, it's likely that you're going to transform the pre-service teacher's beliefs, let alone with the models-based practices or the different content areas that programs are asking pre-service teachers to teach. Thank you for your time, and here's our contact information if there are any questions. Thank you to the Spectrum Institute of Teaching Styles in supporting this research.